to be able to introduce Amy Turner Bushnell, a name I know is familiar to everybody in St. Augustine, but also throughout the U.S. as a historian as well. Amy and I actually were graduate students at the University of Florida together in different departments, and I came to know her well when you took your first job at the Historic St. Augustine Preservation Board as historian, and she developed a great deal of the material that we still see today here in the Colonial Quarter now, but throughout the Living History Museum. She's currently at Brown University as an affiliated faculty and also a research scholar at the John Carter Brown Library. She's been there since the 90s, but has also taught at College of Charleston, was there for several years. And I would have to say that Amy is probably the premier historian of Native American people and their relationships with Europeans in the Southeast. Wow. I would say that, Amy. And also, she has written two major books and dozens of articles, but her book, Situado and Savannah, really brings alive the whole sphere of interaction between Spaniards and Native Americans on the frontier and in St. Augustine. Her book, The King's Coffer, still stands really as the only focused, solid synthesis of 17th century Spanish Florida. She was very popular and still is, of course, on football weekends in Gainesville because she had a great talk on that demonic game, the pelota game of the Appalachian Indians. And when Amy wrote, she published a paper on that and gives the talk, and it sounds just exactly like the Florida LSU game. So we'll see. I was glad also that Paul Hoffman brought up the fact that social history of St. Augustine is really understudied and only recently has become a focus. And Amy Bushnell was really one of the very first people to do social history, and that is what she does. It's about people and where they live and how they live. And more recently, she's been collaborating with Jack Green, we heard about from the founder of the Chesapeake School on Atlantic world, putting Florida and Florida's peoples into a much larger global perspective. So welcome, Amy Bushnell.
My paper is so different from what you've already heard that you're probably going to drum me right out of the room, because I'm not going to talk about the chapter that I wrote. I'm going to talk about the excitement of being a historian and about how something that you do leads you to do something else, and they're all related, and the problem is that there are so many interesting things. And you start doing this for a while and that for a while. I call this galloping off in all directions, the confessions of a Florida historian. So it's interesting how the smaller pieces that we write don't want to let go of us. They stay in our minds, and they will often lead us into other projects. Michael Gannon asked me to write that chapter. No, it's in front of my paper. Okay, now. He asked me to write Republic of Spaniards, Republic of Indians, because he liked an earlier piece of mine, and this chapter really is new material, but it's related to something earlier, which was called Ruling the Republic of Indians, that came out in a book called Powhatan's Mantle. And it was edited by Greg Wazelkoff and Peter Wood and Tom Hatley. But those two pieces did not exhaust my interest in the subject of Indian and Spanish relations. And so I went on and wrote 4 more pieces on different aspects of that. And one of them was called Gastos de Indios, the Indian expense, the Crown and the Chiefdom Presidio Compact in Florida, which was published in Seville in a book called El Gran Norte Mexicano. So you may not have run into it. Another piece was called Spain's Conquest by Contract, Pacification in the Mission System in Eastern North America. That was published in a collection of Lehigh lectures under the title of The World Turned Upside Down. So you might not have seen it either. But there have been 2 invited lectures, and I know you haven't seen them because they've not been published yet. One, The Reconciled Frontier and Its Markers, a design for the borders of early America. And another one is a quotation it starts with. These people have not been conquered like those of New Spain. That's what one of the Florida governors said. And that's about Florida's reciprocal colonial contract. In that one, which I especially like, I say that this is a reciprocal contract between Spaniards and Indians because the Spanish had to live up to it too. And if they didn't, the contract was null and void. They had to keep providing magic, successful magic. They had to be the most powerful people or military force in the region. And they had to provide gifts and trade goods. And if they did not continue to do that, then the contract was void. And the king had obligations as well as Indians. So I've been thinking that it might be fun to gather these things together and publish them in a little book called about the Chieftain Presidio Alliances. And maybe then I'll finally get it out of my hair. The chapter called The Great Corn Controversy in my book, Situado en Sabana, did not go far enough. I was convinced that I needed to say more about it. And so I wrote an essay called In Times of Hunger, All Men Quarrel and All Have Reason, which is a quotation from the Bishop of Cuba when he was trying to reconcile the fights that were going on at St. Augustine over who had the right to sequester corn. And it's based on 4 incidents in the 1680s and 90s. It focuses on the problems of provisioning the colony in a time of food shortage. Everybody here has been talking about food and the importance of the supplies of food, of what you were eating, how you adapt yourself to food. And I've been interested in that too, the problems of food shortage. And I thought that under these conditions, a royal governor really had no choice but to requisition private reserves, even if they belonged to a priest. And he had to trust that the community would stand behind him. Because in a time of crisis, what made government work was not the distant crown, but your local connections. And you could get in real trouble if you didn't attend to them. But I wasn't through with that subject. That essay made me think about the power of food scarcity and food security in pre-modern societies generally. And so I wrote an essay that I gave last year at the Huntington called Freedom from Want, the quest for food security in the Americas before Columbus. And believe me, that made me read a lot of archaeology. And I'm saving that for a book that I'll mention later. When David Hurst Thomas was editing his wonderful 3-volume Columbian Consequences back in the early 1990s, I, like most of the historians and archaeologists you know, contributed a piece to it, and mine was called The Sacramental Imperative, which was about the need of Catholics to stay within reach of the sacraments. And that is something that Florida's seasonally nomadic peoples found difficult to do. But I wasn't through thinking about that subject. So when James Muldoon was editing his book on the spiritual conversion of the Americas, I contributed a piece called None of These Wandering Nations Has Ever Been Reduced to the Faith, which again is another quotation from another bishop. And he's talking about Chile, not Florida. So I was extending the model of that related conversion to levels of mobility I extended it from Florida to the Gran Chaco, to Araucanía in Chile, to the Gran Chichimeca in northern New Spain, to the Sierra de Oaxaca, Chiapas, the Llanos de Mojos in the Amazon, the Republic of the Guaranis in Paraguay, and New France. And I was discovering what fun it is to write comparative history. If you know something about Florida, you've got a key into all kinds of places, because there are many, many frontiers. Especially the maritime frontiers are the exciting ones for me. When Jack Green and Phil Morgan were editing a book on critical appraisals of Atlantic history, and they needed a chapter on the Indians of both continents, they asked me to recommend somebody to write it. And I tried and tried to think, who is reading about the Indians of the Americas as a whole? And I couldn't come up with anybody. And so they said, then you have to do it. And they twisted my arm, and I thought, well, we've got to have a chapter in there about Indians. And so I tried. And I wrote the essay called Indigenous America and the Limits of the Atlantic World, 1493 to 1825. Well, that was way beyond what I could do. But it started me thinking about this. And so I've been, nowadays, any new topic that I take up seems to lead me back to that. And I'm writing something now on Indian slavery in the Americas, but it's got to fit into a larger study of the whole hemisphere. And this is not just Latin America anymore, not just the Portuguese and the Spanish, but I got to know about societies living who are being written about in French or in Russian or in Dutch or in English. Not going to leave them out. And of course, I don't read all those languages. So this is something of synthesis. I have to read what other people have written. And historians always do that, or at least we should. But anyway, it's going to fit into a larger hemispheric study, if I live long enough, that's going to be called The Indomitable Nations, Patterns of Security, Autonomy, and Domain in the Indian Americas, which means South America, North America, Arctic, all over the place. I don't know what I'm thinking about. The recent conferences on Florida's Hispanic heritage, sparked by the quincentenary of Ponce de Leon's accidental discovery, have led many of us to rethink Florida's early years and led to some wonderful papers. I will never forget the session that I went to at the University of Miami that had Jean Lyon, Paul Hoffman, Kathy Deegan, Jerry Malanich. This is the best stuff I've seen in years. And anyway, I have one piece in a book that's going to be coming out shortly on Florida's Hispanic heritage, called A Land Renowned for War, Florida as a Maritime Marchland. And in it I argue that Spanish Florida was not a failure. It's been called a failure by a lot of people, but it survived, and it did what it was designed to do for 2.5 centuries. And that's longer than lots of countries. And I believe that whoever it was who just spoke to us about the military keeping St. Augustine alive, he is right on the mark. Who was that? Is he still here? You. Yes. Harry what? Harry Metz. Harry Metz. Harry Metz is the man. Okay. Let me see. In my first book, which Kathy kindly mentioned, The King's Coffer, I was concentrating on the royal officials of the Treasury. And in the second one, Citoyen and Sabana, I concentrated on the political economy of the Presidio and the provinces. But I'm also interested in Florida's officers, soldiers, and sailors as people. And in a book edited by Raquel Chang Rodriguez, whom some of you may know, a book to which Jean Lyon and Gerald Malanich also contributed, I published a piece called A Requiem for Lesser Conquerors, which is about those ordinary soldiers and ordinary officers who are Spaniards who were caught in an unfinished conquest by the sword, when Spain's policy shifted to conquest by the gospel and made them morally redundant. In a larger study, I've been asking what it meant to the governors of Florida for their post to be maritime. I was going to call that the saltwater frontier, but that phrase has been recently applied to the area around Long Island Sound, so I had to find another title. And I think I'm going to call it the patchwork sails, to emphasize the governor's problem-solving ingenuity. And they were really ingenious. Could go on into that story, but I mustn't get sidelined into stories. Questions about the connection between martial values and honor could also be asked about Indian societies. And a piece that I wrote a couple of years ago called The Warrior Nations, Non-European Conquest and Expansion in the Americas was an attempt to try to do that and to add another chapter to that long, unfinished book that will probably never be finished. In a book edited by Richmond Brown, I published a piece called Escape of the Nicoleers, which was about Jonathan Dickinson and his party who were shipwrecked on the coast of Florida and made their way to St. Augustine and then to Charleston and Philadelphia. And their adventures, this castaway and his party, they made their way from Jupiter Inlet to St. Augustine in 1696. I'm planning to expand on that too. In a book called Quaker Odyssey, Jonathan Dickinson's travels in Florida and Carolina, there are about 3 chapters written of that. But I would really love to do for Dickinson's journal what Andres Reséndez did so brilliantly in that book, A Land So Strange, which is about the relation of Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. When remember he was a survivor of the Pánfilo de Narváez expedition and traveled through Texas and way over to the other coast and eventually reached Spanish territory again. And became governor of Paraguay, which would be a lovely story, except that they sent him home in chains. He was trying to do too much for the Indians. Now, teaching with a Spanish Florida specialty outside the state of Florida, which I have almost always done, presents its challenges, as you can imagine. Who's going to ask you to teach a course on Florida when you're not in Florida? You have to figure out how to fit what you know into a larger field. And as a result, I have taught courses on frontiers, borderlands, backcountries, and Indians. And I've taught them in Alabama, South Carolina, California, Maryland, Rhode Island, Michigan, and most recently, Germany. It's been great fun. Excuse me. Wasn't sure I was going to even make it here. I've also been trying to organize symposia and sessions designed to make historians think twice before they leave us out, which they find it so easy to do. The first of those, which emerged from some parallel seminars that Jack and I gave at Michigan State on colonial centers and colonial peripheries, was behind the book Negotiated Empires, Centers and Peripheries in the Americas, which was edited by Chris Daniels and Michael Kennedy. I organized some sessions for the AHA on the Spanish backcountry, which I don't know if anybody else had ever put those 2 words together, but it seemed to me that Anglo settlers crossing into the Floridas were also extending the backcountry, and yet backcountry historians were not admitting to it. We needed to be part of that field too. And this year at a symposium at the John Carter Brown Library, in which Paul Hoffman and Susan Parker both participated, we studied the subject of Florida, the missing piece. And there were some really great papers and comments, which we will do more with. At that time, I collaborated with the map librarian at the John Carter Brown Library, who's Susan Danforth, on an exhibition called The Florida Story, 1513 to 1783, reconnaissance and rivalry on a maritime periphery. And it was so exciting to see the wonderful things that she pulled out of the rare books and map collections of that wonderful research library. But back to why Florida is a missing piece. What are the reasons? People do things for a reason, we tell ourselves. I see 3 reasons for early Floridas being consistently left out of one field after another. The first is that, unlike Spanish-speaking colonists in New Mexico, Texas, and California, Spanish speakers in Florida facing a change of flags could pack up, board a ship, and try their luck somewhere else. Thank goodness not all of them did, as you were telling us. What's your name?
Linda.
Linda. Are you Linda Solano? Okay.
Yes.
Right. I'm glad to know you. I know some of your relatives.
Well, I know you wrote about it. I didn't realize you were here. That's where I got a lot of my information.
Well, good for you. But this habit of picking up and leaving leaves Spanish Florida's history without the kind of constituency that comes from a continuous, large-scale occupancy. And that makes it a little bit harder to claim a constituency. You've got to have somebody who really tries. And it doesn't help things that the Florida missions were biodegradable. They don't leave adobe ruins to serve as tourist attractions or inspire architectural styles like in New Mexico or in California or Texas. A second reason was already referred to, and that's the 16th century English and Dutch wartime propaganda enshrined in the anti-Spanish and anti-Catholic Black legend instilled into English speakers at their mother's knee. It's still there. But who wants to accuse his colleagues or her colleagues of that kind of thoughtless prejudice? I certainly don't like to get into it. The third and perhaps most important reason is that Spanish Florida's history is so long. It stretches across 3 centuries, which means that it has a chance to change character several times. You simply cannot boil it down into a couple of short paragraphs for a general history, because nothing stays the same. The capital city changes. The colony surrenders its territorial claims over and over, getting more and more concentrated. The provinces come and go. It even splits in 2. So I've been playing with a framework that I call 7 takes on colonial Florida, acknowledging that there is one frontier after another and that they all have different characters. Florida can be many things as it moves across time and space, and each of those things is part of a larger field to which we could attach it if we knew how. So, the first one I say is the frontier of conquest, a marchland. Spain's campaigns to control strategic seaways and its related conquests of Indians by the sword produced a presidio in St. Augustine with financial and administrative links to New Spain and the Caribbean. Florida was a maritime marchland like Chile and like the Philippines and like many others. We can fit that into that story. We can fit it. It's a frontier of pacification, which is a borderland. Spain used missions and gift-based alliances to extend its influence into North America. But the conquest by contract and by the gospel was still sometimes being backed up by the sword. There was no other way around it. I once asked in a review essay in the William and Mary Quarterly whether Florida was a borderland or a border sea. I'm still not sure what we ought to be calling it. Third, a frontier of license, or a periphery. A periphery I defined once as the farthest place where the rule of law of a certain empire is recognized. So that takes it pretty far out. The law holds in this distant place, and that's the periphery of your polity or your sphere of influence, or whatever. Now, that's a frontier of license because the law gives out and license prevails. Smuggling, slaving, contraband, all kinds of things. Florida's limited natural resources left Floridanos relatively free of crown control. One governor, Governor Juan de Salinas, once said, "We are so few here that we make no noise." Well, he managed in a time of war to supply the colony and to keep it going in spite of the fact that he was not getting supplies regularly from Veracruz. He was not getting funds from the Royal Treasury in Mexico City. He was able, in a time of great neglect, to maintain this place. I mean, that's ingenious. I really have to admire people who could hold on in this military place when the payroll did not come through, when there was a sequestration of the situado, when government shut down. Like colonists on other Latin American peripheries, the people in Florida dealt in contraband, they siphoned funds from the Royal Treasury, they helped themselves to Indian labor, and they co-opted the chiefs. That's how they made it happen. Fourth is a frontier of non-white migration. In Spanish, it would be called a despoblado. After epidemics and slave raiders depopulated first the mission provinces and then the retreats of non-agricultural Indians in the lower half of the peninsula, Creek refugees and African Maroons moved into this demographic vacuum, settled down, and began to raise cattle. And they developed into the Seminoles, as you know. The fifth frontier, a frontier of imperial entanglement. And I'm boiling these things down. There could be 20 of these, and I'm just giving you 7. But this is a Guardacosta base. Spain, France, and Britain, vying for hegemony in the southeast, reinforced their garrisons and competed for Indian allies. This is when Pensacola was founded in 1698 on the Gulf. But for all of its Coast Guard vessels, St. Augustine, which by then had no hinterland to provision its population, which was growing because the Presidio was, it was itself drawn into a net of clandestine Atlantic commerce. There was no way around it. Now, the frontier of plantations, the Low Country, you could call it, because East and West Florida, well, actually, Florida was ceded to Britain in 1763, which split it into East and West Florida. And these two Floridas spent 20 years or 21 years as extensions of the Carolina and Georgia Low Country, growing rice, creating plantations, increasing the number of slaves. A lot of things were happening there that were also happening in Georgia and Carolina. The developers, who were largely Scots because of the Union of Crowns in Great Britain, they concentrated on reconnaissance, land grants, plantations, forest products, and briefly on provisioning when thousands of American loyalists and their slaves poured across the borders. They weren't there for very long, but while they were there was a big boom for these planters in raising provisions and in supplying them with cheap lumber to build their little shacks. Now, the last one I'll mention is the backcountry, frontier of American settlement. Finding it difficult to police the Floridas, which had become magnets for revolutionaries, non-Spanish settlers, and invaders like Andrew Jackson and various filibusterers, that's what I should say. Spain sold the two colonies to the United States in 1819. Actually, it was a deal to satisfy debts. And Spain moved out when the new authorities arrived to keep order, which took them 2 years to get there. To conclude, there are 2 small books that I would really love to do. and I probably am not going to get around to them. One of them, though, is started thanks to invitations from Flagler College and the University of Miami to do workshops for high school teachers. It's a set of translations of the 8 conflicting accounts of the 1668 pirate raid on St. Augustine. These guys came from Jamaica, and they called themselves privateers because they had a license from the governor of Jamaica, Governor Thomas Modiford. And he, as they explained to the parish priest, this governor gave them a license to kidnap or take away to sell as a slave anyone who was not a Spaniard. This was a shocking thing in St. Augustine because lots of people were regarded as Spaniards. They had Spanish fathers, and maybe they were part black or part Indian, but they were not enslavable peoples as far as the Spanish were concerned. And so he pled with this privateer, but to no avail, as far as I know. Anyway, I see these 8 conflicting accounts, and they're so much fun to read, as a problem in how to weigh evidence and construct a narrative from flawed sources. Somebody's got to be telling a lie, or they'd all agree, right? But any way you want to cut it, that's a rousing, good story. The other book, which so far is no more than a gleam in my eye, would be a book about Captain Francisco Fuentes. Some of you know him, don't you? Have you ever met Captain Francisco Fuentes? He was really important in the 17th century. In the last 25 years that there were provinces in Florida, he was in the thick of it, wherever. His reports to the governors are full of excitement and of passionate dialogue. If you want to learn the language of Spanish invective, or if you want to find out what was going on under the surface, and that mixture of Florida's soldiers and missionaries and chiefs, all you have to do is to read Fuentes. So if I don't get around to writing about him, I hope that one of you will.
One question before I open it up. We talked about puzzles, and puzzles were really interesting. And Amy and Dan, I've got a question for you guys. First of all, you said Florida's the missing piece, and I've got 2 questions. Where does Florida fit in as the missing piece? And more importantly, what does it fit into?
Florida fits into colonial history of Latin America, the colonial history of North America, and into Indian history, and into borderlands, sorry about that, into borderlands history, into backcountry history, into frontier history. There are just a whole lot of areas in which the findings that we have would enlighten those fields and would help them to think of new questions. It makes you wonder what makes history significant, what makes us choose what areas are worth studying. And I've thought about that. I haven't written about the problem, but it remains. And I think, how do you know what's significant? What fields in history are significant? Those are the fields that people get hired to teach in colleges. And if you do not have positions in colleges, that is not a significant field. So that's where we need to work on, right?
But they're not hiring anybody, so it doesn't matter. So there's no significant fields.
I'd add to it that Florida really is an important part of the Atlantic world. Atlantic world studies are so important now, and Florida has until quite recently been sort of left out of that. It seems to me that more and more Florida is fitting into the historian's Atlantic worldview as well.
Yes, that's true. But if you look at the histories of colonial North America, they are trying to add something Spanish, but what do they add? New Mexico. Why? Why is it New Mexico? Well, it's founded at the same time as Jamestown. It's so easy to compare them. And you don't have to say much about it because it's so far away. It's not in contact, you know, and so it isn't all complicated. And St. Augustine starts so much earlier. What are you going to compare it with? Only with Spanish frontiers, because those are the only other ones there are. And so I understand that you have to leave out Florida. It's too hard. So we'll do New Mexico instead. And they do a pretty good job of New Mexico. But we're right here on the edge of their colonies. Why can't we be part of the story? We have an entanglement of empires. We're right here ready to entangle. But there's another field that, strangely, is leaving Florida out more and more. And that is the Spanish borderlands themselves, which are getting to define themselves as an extension of New Spain, you know, Greater Mexico. Well, that doesn't really leave room for Florida. Florida isn't attached to Greater Mexico except financially, which is really important. But New Spain is supporting that treasury in Mexico City, is supporting not only Florida and New Mexico, but the Philippines. And we don't say, oh, the Philippines have to be part of our story. No, that's Latin Asia, that's not Latin America. So, you know, there are problems. But, for instance, there's a brand new, wonderful book out, edited by Brian DeLay, is it not, on the borderlands. And it doesn't have Florida in it. Why not? And also, a new definition of borderlands has come out that says Maine is a borderland, and Vermont, and I can understand, of course, surely they are, but we can have a broader and a non-Spanish definition of borderlands. That suits me, if that's what we want. I'd rather have things larger than smaller and smaller, except that I think we need to lobby. We need to be visible. And I'm trying to do something about it. And I'm not the only one. We need to speak up for ourselves here.
And speaking of speaking up for ourselves, anybody have any questions who wants to speak up from the audience?
Define borderlands. Well, now some people define borderlands as the space between two European powers, okay? Or two white powers, American, United States, we would call them European, but they're descended from Europeans. Mexico also, I mean, Mexico and the United States, they have a borderland because they're white people on both sides. Is there a borderland with Indians, between Europeans and Indians, or Euro-Americans and Indians? That's called a frontier. Why, you know? Why are Indians treated like they're a different kind of people? In Europe, I mean, all the different nations of ethnicities, you know, Poles and Bohemians and whoever, they're all part of the same mix. Why are Indians different? Why are they supposed to be treated specially, given special, you know, we cannot ever criticize anything they do because they are lo the poor Indians. I just believe nations are nations, and some of them are of this kind, some are of that kind, and we need to bring them all into the continental history.
An observation and a question. Dan might be interested to know that there's a retired ecologist from the Florida Museum of Natural History, Dick Franz, who's using your book in conjunction with the Bartram narratives to, one, find the sites of the plants that Bartram described in his travels, and having found those sites, to determine if the plant is still there. That's been sort of an ongoing hobby of his now. The other is really to go back to both of you spoke about the issue of Native American slavery. There's been a goodly amount published from the English perspective. Alan Galley in particular is, I think, very good. But very little seemingly from the Spanish colonial experience in talking about the problem of slave raids and the effects on the local populations and so on, other than your basic, really culturally, your government reports. Is there anyone who's writing from that perspective? And I'm particularly interested, as the director of Mission San Luis de Apalache, to be able to train my staff to be able to interpret that for visitors.
Diane Bossy.
Okay.
Denise.
Denise Bossy.
Denise
I'm sorry.
Bosse.
Okay.
How do you spell
She
that?
would correct you.
All right. I'm sorry, I was saying her name wrong. But does she not write about?
She is right now writing about, I've not seen it. She's at the University of North Florida in the history department. You might give a call.
How's her name spelled?
What is she writing about?
Bossy.
Okay, as it sounds.
Bosse. Denise
About
Bosse.
slavery.
She has a PhD from Yale.
Okay, thanks.
And is working on that. But just reach her at the University of North Florida History Department.
Of course,
Sir?
Bartolome de las Casas wrote a lot about it, too.
Hi, I'm Bob Stewart. I'm from Alabama, but lived here many years ago. I had the pleasure of working with Kathy and Amy at the Old Historic Preservation Board. Thanks for letting an outsider come in and interrupt on this wonderful conference. Thank you. I don't know anything about the Fuentes journal or diaries or
Just reports.
as I was chatting with you earlier, I had the opportunity, totally outside my field, to write an entry in the Alabama Encyclopedia. The journal of Andre Pinnacle, the ship carpenter who accompanied Iberville in the settlement, the exploration and settlement of the Gulf Coast, Mobile, and eventually New Orleans, 1699 to I guess about 1711 when he went back to France. And the reason why I felt comfortable in doing it was because there's a wonderful translation of it. And it was done by an English professor, Richard McWilliams, many years ago. And Pinnacle came to be called Alabama's first literary figure because McWilliams, in translating it, sort of described Pinnacle's journals as being a product of sort of the Renaissance thinking and first encountered between the French and the natives of the lower Gulf Coast, lower Alabama River, and then of course the Mississippi. So my question is there a comparable sort of piece of writing from early Spanish Florida that you would nominate as sort of Florida's or journalist or writer or reporter like Fuentes that you would nominate as Florida's first literary figure? And the other part of that is trying to reconcile between a literary scholar's perspective on the historical document and the translation of that, and a historian's use of that strictly as a piece of factual documentation. And have you ever had a chance to sort of collaborate or think in those terms?
Well, I don't pretend to be literary. You are more, that's more down your alley.
Can't help you with that, no. Fascinating question.
Well, there's been a lot of study on the DeSoto relations. There are some fantastic pieces of literature that do come out of Florida history, and they go way, way back. There's the Escobedo poem. There is a report that, there is the story of, who is this Andres, that John Han, you know the guy who was San Miguel. Andres de San Miguel, of course. His report about the northern Temupa along that Mocamo, is it not? Takapukuru? the Menendez letters themselves are fantastic. Dickinson. Oh, there's Dickinson too. Dickinson's journal. Yes, it doesn't have to be all in Spanish. And people like Alonso de Leturiundo, who wrote a memorial to the King of Spain, and it's pretty long. There, you know, you really just start thinking about it, and there are a lot of things that are worth reading. What? Diego de Peña. Diego de Peña. Right, Diego Peña. And what?
Fontaneda.
Yes, of course. And, I mean, speak up. I mean, all the rest of you know pieces too. Fontaneda is the one that Jean Lyon was mentioning. And there is one of the Florencias, the famous Florencia family in Florida. One of them became a priest and became a historian. He has some books. There's Francisco Pareja, rather. And there's somebody named Jaime, or also Bartolome Martinez, who went down to Potosi and wrote, at the request of his Jesuit confessor, a report of his conversations with the sole survivor of the attacks on the Jesuit mission at Ajacan in the Chesapeake. There's some great pieces of history and literature. It's hard for me to separate them because some of the letters from governors are just so interesting that you could be just reading them for pleasure and for information both. And how do you say, well, this is literature and that is not? I've never found it very easy to distinguish. So.
Well, thank you very much. I feel like I'm at the McCarthy hearings with two microphones, but we'll soldier on. Thanks again. Hopefully.
Can I ask a question of Jean Lyon and of Kathy, and I'm not sure who all is out there, but is there any possibility that there can be another investigation and the location of Fort Caroline could be found? I know that, I mean, I say this because I know there are just people that are digging and pulling things up and finding the weapons, and they're just like thieves out there. And I'm wondering if there's any possibility of finding that location now, or is it long gone, washed in the river?
I think your colleagues at University of North Florida, Keith Ashley and Buzz Toonen, could probably answer that question better, since they've been working really diligently, I guess, with the grant from the state of Florida to search for Fort Caroline without success. And there are several new sort of ideas floating around about different locations for Fort Caroline, but it does seem to be one of those most elusive of Florida markers.
The president reproduced Fort Caroline is the proper site.
To repeat what he said, that Jean Lyon said, it does not appear that the present monument of Fort Caroline, where the fort is reproduced, is in fact the site of where it was. But many, many people, as you know, many from UNF have worked pretty seriously at looking for it. Sure.
Thanks for coming. We've got cots if you want to spend the night because we're starting early in the morning. So thank you very much. We'll hopefully see you. Thank you.